OHST for arranging this talk and this visit. It's great to be back here, familiar surroundings. Not entirely familiar. I'm usually sitting on that side for dozens of these colloquia, so it's kind of odd to be sitting up here in the speaker's chair. But very nice to be back in Berkeley. This talk actually, as Massimo suggests, combines two of my recent research and teaching interests, aerospace and surfing. And I see that Dave Kaiser will be here next week talking about how the hippies saved physics. Surfing and hippies, it's kind of nice to see that Berkeley is still flying the countercultural flag. Although, on the other hand, aerospace does not seem to be countercultural, but perhaps this talk will change some perceptions about that. So first, the aerospace part. A century ago, in 1910, 250,000 people converged on a grassy field in Los Angeles over a 10-day period. They came to see a new technology, just a few years old, that promised to define the new century. The LA Air Meet of 1910 was the first international meet in the United States. The LA Times declared it one of the greatest public events in the history of the West. And the judgment seems fair in retrospect. Over the next 100 years, the aircraft and aerospace industries transformed Southern California from a collection of Sunbelt orange groves to a high-tech metropolis. And this is a picture of one of the early planes over the grandstand at the Dominguez Hills Airfield, where the aviation meet was held, and a little publicity flyer for it. You can see one thing down here is Pacific Electric Railway is one of the sponsors of it. Henry Huntington, of course, that's his network of red cars that was the mass transit system for Los Angeles at the time. Some of you might remember the scene from Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Who needs a car in LA? We've got the best public transportation system in the world. Anyway, times change. Southern California, as we know it, would not exist without aerospace. This fact is not always appreciated by the general public, but it is also, perhaps more surprisingly, not always addressed by historians. That neglect is in part because there are not many easily accessible sources. We are trying to do something about that in a collaboration between USC and the Huntington Library to create an archive on Southern California aerospace. This archive will include both documentary collections and oral histories. At the Huntington Library, we've already acquired several collections of personal papers and done about 30 oral histories, and we are expanding those efforts continuously. We aim to provide a range of perspectives on the aerospace industry, and I'll here briefly survey some of them. And then we'll look in more detail at a particular example of aerospace influence on Southern California culture. Now, for the Aerospace History Project, we're trying to answer two basic historical questions. One, why did Southern California become a focal point for aerospace? And two, what were the consequences of this concentration for the region, for the nation, and for aerospace itself? For the first question, why aerospace in Southern California, the usual answer is just the weather. Southern California sunshine lets you build planes year-round and lets you build planes outdoors and fly them year-round. Okay, but many other places in the country have nice weather, and the California coast is socked in by fog for large parts of the year, which is terrible for flying. And most airplanes were, in the end, constructed indoors, not outdoors. So answering this question is not just a matter of meteorology. There are other factors involved. Local universities, which were a source of research, testing facilities, and scientific and engineering labor. This is especially the case of Caltech, where von Karman, of course, created one of the first aeronautics programs in the United States with Guggenheim funding. Aerospace connections, though, expanded to other local universities. Convair and General Atomics engineers down in San Diego helped create UC San Diego and designed its science and engineering curriculum. Or you can go to USC now and visit the Hughes Engineering Building. Another factor, the open shop labor market. Aircraft plants only began to be unionized in the 1930s, and even then, the connection to defense industry constrained union activity. For instance, strikes were portrayed as threats to national security. Another factor was local boosters, city boosters, who helped organize and fund the LA Air Meet, including our friend Henry Huntington. And some of these city fathers looked to aviation as the future of LA. First of all, as a possible basis for mass transit. LA had lots of open space, which a lot of ground to cover between, say, Santa Monica and Pasadena. And there was talk about a system aircraft for mass transit. By 1929, there were 53 airfields within 30 miles of LA City Hall. But city fathers also touted the potential of the aviation industry. As one local businessman put it in 1926, there is going to be a Detroit of the aircraft industry. Why not here in Los Angeles? So you have people like Harry Chandler as major promoters of aircraft for LA. Chandler helped finance Donald Douglas, which brings us to another factor, and that is finance. Southern California had few established industries to absorb venture capital, so new industries literally capitalized on this. Hollywood for one, but also these fledgling aircraft firms. Cheap land was another factor. Believe it or not, the LA basin once enjoyed bountiful open space and cheap real estate. One might also consider a general entrepreneurial culture, nurtured by the sort of risk takers who helped populate the American West. Risk-taking especially characterized some of these early flyers who took on alarming odds each time they flew. And some of these early aviation photo albums they abound with these heartbreaking photos of dashing young men, usually men, at an aircraft controls, followed by twisted scenes of wreckage. Here is a photo of Arch Hoxsey. He was one of the Wright flyers, this team of pilots the Wright brothers sponsored and sent around the country. How he spent the last week of 1910. This is December 1926. He's being carried off the Dominguez Hills airfield to the cheers of a crowd of 75,000 after setting a new world altitude record. 5 days later, Hoxsey augured in from 7,000 feet and was dead at the age of 26. This risk-taking extended to the business side, including the flyers who came to the LA Air Meet, liked what they saw and stuck around to build planes. This includes Glenn Martin. Here he is in 1910, started building planes in the local Methodist church. There's something about aerospace and churches, as we'll see. He then moved to an abandoned apricot cannery before finally moving back east. But meanwhile, Donald Douglas, started working under Martin. Here he is in the Martin offices, and then struck out on his own, starting out in the back of a barber shop on Pico, those of you who know LA. In 1922, he located to a former movie studio in Santa Monica. Ironically enough, 8 years later, a lot of movie studios are now moving into abandoned aircraft plants. The Lockheed brothers actually started up here in the Bay Area, then moved to Santa Barbara, the site of this photo, before moving south. Tired of being called Loghead or Lughead, they Americanized their last name to what we now know as Lockheed. And also from Santa Barbara, I have to give Santa Barbara a little airtime here. Jack Northrop started with Lockheed in Santa Barbara, then worked for Douglas, then went back to Lockheed, and then finally struck out on his own, founding Northrop. Now, these kind of peregrinations suggest another reason Southern California became an epicenter for aerospace. Once a few firms had located here, they had the benefit of what economists call agglomeration. Manufacturers had access to a specialized, skilled workforce, including these engineers bouncing around from firm to firm, spreading ideas, but also a network of skilled suppliers, such as high-tolerance machine shops, things like that. Okay, so much for why the aircraft industry concentrated in Southern California. What about the second question? What were the effects of this concentration? We can consider the effects on California, on the aerospace industry itself, and on American science and technology. For science and technology, consider that aerospace was one of the largest industrial sectors for science and technology throughout much of the 20th century. Southern California Aerospace was one of the main employers of scientists and engineers in the U.S., one of the main consumers of science and engineering research, and one of the main producers of advanced technologies influencing fields far removed from aircraft and spacecraft. Aerospace introduced a major manufacturing industry into a new social and cultural context, away from the traditional industrial heartland in the nation's northeast. It also represented a high-tech industry based on advanced R&D, and thus provided an important model for the high-tech regions that have sprung up around the world. But while historians have focused much attention on Silicon Valley and Route 128, more recently on places like Bangalore, Novosibirsk, they have largely ignored Southern California as perhaps the premier example of a technopole. Aerospace provides a major example of the intersection of science and engineering, which historians have examined for other industries and periods, most notably the telegraph and electrical industries in the 19th century. Aerospace is also a prime example of the importance not only of design engineering, but also production or manufacturing engineering. That is, having conceived this new aircraft, how do you actually go out and build it? And I think aerospace provides a lot of fertile ground for historians looking at the shop floor as a source of innovation. Those of you here at OHST don't need any reminders about this. I think especially the special volume by Fox and Guanini on the electrical industry in the late 19th century as looking at the shop floor as a source of scientific innovation, creativity. Whoops, this is a shot of the Lockheed shop floor in the late 1920s, but this is the same place, Lockheed, circa 1929 or so. And I think you can learn a lot going from this photo to this photo, which is a photo of Lockheed about 35 years later, mid-1960s, building the SR-71 Blackbird, going from plywood to titanium, and a highly classified environment of that. Aerospace, also the source, of course, for what became known as systems engineering or systems management, which is the art of building complex technical systems like the Blackbird and balancing individual technical creativity with collective goals, with the hundreds or thousands of people working on these large aerospace projects. Other relevant questions include the relation between civilian and military science and technology, and also between aero and space. That is, how and why aircraft companies entered the space business, and how smooth was the transition from mass-producing airplanes to building one-off or small batch spacecraft. A final question concerns the importance of place. What did it mean for aerospace engineering to have so much of it carried out in a particular place? Did Southern California leave a particular stamp on aerospace technology? Is there a distinctive Southern California style of airplane or spacecraft? Would stealth aircraft, say, look the way they do if they had been built anywhere else? Did Southern California attract or nurture a particular sensibility, one attuned to the imaginative possibilities and the public appeal of flight? If so, it would be fitting for the airplane, which has helped collapse space and drive globalization, to itself reflect the particular place of its production. Okay, these are all questions from the perspective of science and technology. But what about aerospace impact on Southern California itself? That is, what does aerospace mean for historians of California and the West? A little different angle on things. Well, first of all, it shaped the geography. The industry clustered around airfields, especially Grand Central Terminal in Glendale. These are all set up basically in the 1920s, late 1920s. Grand Central, around which Lockheed, among other firms, built up, Glendale and Burbank. Clover Field in Santa Monica. Again, Santa Monica looks a little bit different these days. Those of you who've taken the Clover Field off-ramp off the 10, that's Clover Field. And Mines Field, which has changed a little bit. This is now LAX. Again, times change. So this sparked a new model of suburban growth centered on these satellite cities instead of growing radially out from a downtown. So you have not only Glendale and Burbank, but then further out in the San Fernando Valley with Rocketdyne and Canoga Park. You have planned communities of Westchester and Lakewood around the kind of LAX nexus, LAX, El Segundo, Downey. And further afield to Santa Barbara, even further beyond Santa Barbara to Lompoc and Vandenberg Air Force Base, south to San Diego along the coast, and then inland to the Antelope Valley, also the Riverside area. Aerospace also shaped Southern California's demographics. It helped double the region's population between 1920 and 1940 and double it again between 1940 and 1960. World War II, of course, a major quantitative shift, although historians argue about how big a qualitative shift it was, but I think there's no argument that it was certainly a quantitative shift. 2 million workers in Southern California aircraft plants. You can see this in the scale of the workforce. Individual plants would have over 100,000 workers. This is a shift change at Lockheed. I'm not sure if you can see this with the light, but I love the speedy feed up here at the full-time soda fountain, 24 hours around the clock. So, shift change, tens of thousands of workers in a particular shift. The scale of the production lines. Some of these plants turned out tens of thousands of airplanes over the course of the war. I think at the high point, the North American plant in Downey was knocking out a P-51 Mustang every 15 minutes. And the scale of the plants, the scale of the planes themselves. This is the Lockheed Constitution, which was under contract with the Navy. They actually ended up, they couldn't find power plants or engines big enough to power it, so they ended up only building 2. But this picture was taken towards the end of the war. 2 groups were especially prominent in the wartime plants. One, of course, was women, the famous Rosie the Riveter. Here's a worker in the Solar Air plant building exhaust manifolds. By 1944, women made up over 40% of the aircraft workforce in LA, and at some plants the proportion was much greater, approaching 90% at Douglas. The other group was the Dust Bowl migrants, who came to California in the 1930s and found work in aircraft plants. By 1945, there were over 500,000 Southerners in local aircraft factories, what war reporter Ernie Pyle called the aviation Okies. Now, these Okies gave LA culture a Dust Bowl inflection. For one thing, made LA a center for country music. They also gave LA the highest concentration of white Protestants of the 20 largest U.S. cities in 1960. That statistic may also reflect the relative scarcity of Catholics in American science and engineering, another factor shaping Southern California society. That is, the Southern California religious landscape might reflect this aerospace industrial dominance. It may not be coincidence that the Air Force based its first ballistic missile office in an abandoned Catholic parish in Inglewood. Subsequent demographic effects are apparent in the shifting balance between blue-collar manufacturing and white-collar engineering jobs, in the gender balance, again, in the aerospace workforce, which remained a largely male preserve after the war. By 1948, the proportion of women had dropped from 40% to 12%. The defense buildup of the early 50s provided some recovery for women, not so much in manufacturing or in engineering for that matter, but rather often as parts checkers. Here's the Lockheed Parts Listing Department. Or as quote-unquote computers. That is actually computing and comparing especially test data, flight test data, to design theory. This is from JPL mid-1950s or so. This applies also to other ethnic groups, where again the aerospace workforce reflected the demographics of the American engineering profession, which meant fewer African Americans, but also a larger proportion of Asian Americans, making Southern California even more of a pack-rim metropolis. Social and cultural effects appear also in such fields as design. The Eameses, for example, built gliders during World War II and then used aerospace materials such as fiberglass in their design work. Architecture, Joan Didion has called aerospace factories the cathedrals of the Cold War. And one may consider aerospace influence on architecture and design idioms. Bill Leslie is working especially on this. He's doing some stuff on Southern California aerospace architecture, especially the architect William Pereira. Julius Schulman, the photographer, has documented some of these iconic works. What happened to, here we go, out of order. This is the lobby of Convair Astronautics down in San Diego, kind of an iconic photograph. I thank Bill Leslie for a copy of this. Obviously, just from the people gathered around the lobby here, missile making was men's work. In literature, in addition to Joan Didion, who's written frequently about California, Thomas Pynchon got his start as a technical writer in aerospace, and his books, of course, include many aerospace allusions, starting with Gravity's Rainbow. There's also the thriving science fiction community in LA, from Robert Heinlein and Ray Bradbury in the 40s through more recently to people like Larry Niven, Jerry Pournelle. Not all of them directly associated with aerospace, but certainly tapping a vein of technological futurism in Los Angeles. And then there's politics. Aerospace may have reinforced a conservative political orientation in Southern California, perhaps because the initial migrants to the area were well-off Easterners, followed by middle-class Midwesterners, and then finally lower-class migrants, especially Dust Bowl migrants. The area had a conservative political cast. The Cold War regime of security clearances and classification may have strengthened this orientation. Hundreds of thousands of aerospace workers had security clearances that first of all kept them from discussing their work with family, friends, or even colleagues. But also the detailed questionnaires and investigations of the security regime may have encouraged social and political conformity, for instance by discriminating against homosexuals. Basically, applying for security clearance meant coming out of the closet. You had to declare on the form whether you were or were not heterosexual. There's a question here of cause and effect. Did aerospace thrive in Southern California because of existing conservative inclinations, or did the middle-class classified world of aerospace encourage conservative politics? For example, were aviation Okies carriers of conservatism from the Midwest, or rather left-leaning populists who were only turned rightward by SoCal's suburban conformism in the 1950s? This question is outstanding. The answer is probably, of course, both. One might also consider the social effects of the defense economy, with its ups and downs tied to the temperature of the Cold War and knock-on effects in many other industries such as real estate and construction. Détente in the 1970s and the end of the space race led to a major contraction, and resentments percolated through Southern California society. Then boom years returned with a defense buildup starting in the late 70s under Carter, and then of course accelerating in the 1980s, including SDI, Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars. 44% of SDI funding went to California contractors. Then, of course, came the post-Cold War contraction, when economic dislocation contributed not only to the Rodney King riots, but also to episodes such as the Lakewood Spur Posse rape cases. The movie Falling Down, those of you who've seen it or remember it, Michael Douglas from the early 90s plays a laid-off aerospace engineer who goes on a rampage across LA. Another even longer-lasting aerospace legacy is the environment. There are, of course, highly publicized cases of rocket fuel contaminating groundwater, but there's also the general environmental engineering of Los Angeles and how aerospace really shaped the urban ecology of the LA basin in Southern California. For instance, heavy rains in 1941 flooding the Lockheed and Douglas plants turned flood control into an issue of national security and encouraged the concrete channeling of local rivers. Aerospace demand for electricity also helped drive the building of hydropower plants in the Sierras, as well as additional power lines heading out to the Colorado River. Okay. We should also consider, given the presence of this vast high-tech enterprise, how aerospace technologies have influenced, how the aerospace technologies have influenced Southern California, not just the industry itself and the workforce, but the technologies. For instance, the LAPD, high-tech surveillance, aerial sensors, computerized command and control drew on local aerospace technologies, as Mike Davis has argued. What else is Southern California known for? Well, one thing is Hollywood. And I think in the interest of time, I might skip this, but just very briefly, you have these two major industries, Hollywood and aerospace, rubbing shoulders in and around LA. One would expect to find some intersections, aside from people like Howard Hughes or Marilyn Monroe, for that matter. But one example of a technological intersection is computer-generated imaging, digital imaging, computer animation, which came not out of Hollywood studios originally, but especially an important early impetus came out of JPL, the Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena, where a young programmer named Jim Blinn developed some of the really crucial early algorithms for computer animation for the Voyager spacecraft flybys of Jupiter and Saturn. These then sparked the interest of people like George Lucas, Gene Roddenberry. George Lucas actually went out and hired Jim Blinn to work on the Star Wars sequels. Blinn worked with Alvy Ray Smith, Ed Catmull, whose names may be familiar. They went on to found Pixar. And there's a reason these algorithms were developed at a place like JPL instead of Hollywood movie studios, because only places like JPL at the time had, first of all, programmers like Jim Blinn on staff, but also the computing power to run these things. It was only about a decade later or so that the movie studios and the animation houses made the investment in Cray supercomputers to power these algorithms, and also that desktop workstations got powerful enough to run them. Anyway, another example of technological influence from aerospace. What else is Southern California known for? Of course, surf. Here's a postcard you can pick up in any beachfront shop in a coastal town in the Southern California coast. Here I should note that this portion of the talk derives in part from work I've done in collaboration with Peter Nuschel at UC Santa Barbara. Peter and I taught a class there a couple of years ago on the history of surfing, kind of for fun. And in the course of that, we ran across some of this material and did a little more research, and here are some of the results. Okay, California is the epicenter of global surf culture, and surfing in turn defines the Southern California image. Okay, now why is this? Many places in the world have good beaches and waves, so why did surfing, a pre-modern Polynesian pastime, flourish so strongly in Southern California? To answer this question, one might look at what else was happening in this particular place and time, and of course one of the other major historical developments here in Southern California was aerospace. Now, surfing seems to have little to do with airplanes or spacecraft, but in fact, several technologies from aviation and aerospace helped transform surfing. These include Tom Blake's hollow surfboard of the late 1920s, the introduction of polyurethane foam, polyester resin, and fiberglass after World War II, and the boogie board. Each of these intersections greatly expanded surfing's accessibility and popularity. Few historians have examined these connections. Those writing on aerospace have generally neglected aerospace influence on California culture, and from the other direction, most surf writing is inward-looking and fails to consider broader social influences on the sport, and not to mention the fact that few academics are interested in writing about surf culture and the surf community for reasons, well, reasons we can discuss later maybe. Anyway, this paper will examine some of these connections between these two defining characteristics of California. The first example is Tom Blake and the hollow surfboard. A little background first. Surfing, of course, dated back centuries in Polynesia in general, but especially in Hawaii. It had declined in the 19th century with a demographic decimation of the Hawaiian people after European contact, but then revived around 1900 amid the emergence of Hawaiian tourism and the context of political annexation by the United States. In this modern revival, most surfboards were short planks that were very hard to ride. But in the 1910s, Duke Kahanamoku, whose name may be familiar to some of you, Duke Kahanamoku and others, switched to boards that were over 10 feet long, which were much easier to ride, especially for a beginner to figure out how to ride these things. The problem with these bigger boards was weight. These boards were solid redwood planks, which was manageable at 6 or 8 feet length, but you have one of these redwood planks that's 10 or 12 feet long, and it weighs well over 100 pounds. And if you get a 16-foot, what they called an Olo board, a 16-foot redwood plank, you're talking about something close to 200 pounds. So wrangling one of these monsters, even just to get it across the beach, was no easy feat. And then to try to hold onto it while you're paddling through walls of whitewater requires quite a bit of strength. So it's not an easy thing for a beginner to take up. So somebody like Duke Kahanamoku, who's the world's fastest swimmer, Olympic gold medalist, could handle one of these boards, but for a beginner, the prospect is downright dangerous. So surfers started trying some alternatives, especially balsa, which is a very light wood, which is relatively strong, also widely used in the aircraft industry. But balsa's low density means it basically soaks up water like a sponge, which is not, of course, good for a surfboard. Now, another solution emerged from Tom Blake, who came from that surfing hotbed of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. A high school dropout, he met the Duke actually on a swimming tour and then moved to LA and took up surfing. In 1928, he shaped a new board for the Pacific Coast Surfboard Championship, which is a paddle race hosted by the Corona Del Mar Surfboard Club. And here is an invitation for this paddle contest. At the time, there were no surf contests for riding waves themselves, so surfers found their main competitive outlet in these paddleboard races. Extremely popular, attracted huge crowds, thousands of people. Thousands of people came to this particular meet at Corona Del Mar. Blake was an avid competitive paddler, and this pursuit was driving him to think about new board designs, especially how to cut down on the weight. Length provides an advantage, and so does flotation, but heavy redwood boards rode too low in the water and slowed you down. So Blake is thinking about ways to cut down weight, and for this particular meet, he drills hundreds of holes in his 16-foot plank just with a regular drill, and then seals them with a thin veneer of wood. And Blake takes this board to the meet and wins the race going away, dusts his competition. And this is usually viewed by surf historians as the triumphant introduction of the hollow surfboard. But the story, I think, is more interesting. It's probably impossible for you all to see, but there's a list of the names of the competitors here, the attractions, famous members of the Corona Surfboard Club. And one of these competitors is a paddler by the name of Gerard Volti, who is a member of the Corona Surfboard Club and an accomplished surfer. In fact, Volti knew Duke Kahanamoku through the LA Athletic Club. And in June 1925, Volti and Duke had gone camping on Newport Beach to take advantage of a good south swell, middle of summer. A fishing boat capsized in the surf, and Duke, Volti, and their friend Owen Hale paddled out and saved 11 of the 16 passengers, earning them heroic headlines in the LA Times. So that's Duke on the left, Volti in the middle with the surfboard behind him, and Owen Hale on the right. Okay, Volti's day job, however, was as an aircraft designer for Lockheed. Volti had studied aeronautical engineering at Caltech in the early 20s and then gone to work at Douglas Aircraft and then jumped over to Lockheed. Vultee and Jack Northrop designed the Lockheed Vega, a radical new airplane that would be flown by Amelia Earhart and Wiley Post. And those of you who go to the Air and Space Museum will see Amelia Earhart's Vega prominently displayed. The Vega design stressed strength and lightweight, this combination of strength and lightweight. Its particular innovation was the single wing, which is a long, rounded shape with sheets of plywood over wooden struts or ribs. And the real innovation was it was strong enough not to require external bracing coming out from the fuselage. It's just basically laid over the top and doesn't require these struts coming out, propping it up. Okay, the Lockheed Vega was designed by Vultee and Jack Northrop in 1927. This next summer of 1928 was this surfboard meet at Corona del Mar, where Blake gets to hang around on the beach with a Vultee. So you have Blake seeking to build a lighter wooden surfboard, and Vultee, who has just finished building a lightweight wooden aircraft wing. Soon after this, Blake builds a surfboard with, yes, a plywood skin over wooden struts or ribs. Okay, here's a photo of the Vega wing in static load testing. Those are sandbags loaded on the wing. Funny story here, Carl Squire, who's one of the Lockheed managers, walks in during one of the static load tests and picks up a piece of wood behind his back and snaps it. And all the engineers jump about 10 feet because they thought the wing had given way. Anyways, you can, the shape of the wing should maybe remind you of a surfboard. Here are some Vega wings under construction, especially this off on the right. You can kind of see the struts going down the middle, the kind of square sides to the wing. And this is Blake's hollow surfboard. And this was the celebrated Blake hollow surfboard that then went on to kind of make surfboard history, as we'll see. This design involved not drilling out a solid plank, but rather building a hollow surfboard from the ground up, so to speak. Now, this seems more than mere coincidence to us. The subsequent history provides more evidence for this aviation connection. Blake filed for a patent on the hollow board in 1932 and soon licensed the design to the Thomas Rogers Company in Venice Beach. Now, why did he choose them? We don't know for sure, but their main business was making airplane wings. Okay, Blake's hollow board was about half the weight of solid planks, and it paddled much easier. It rode higher in the water. Beginners especially liked hollow boards since they made it easier to catch waves. More important, beginners had easy access to them because they were mass-produced by companies like the Thomas Rogers Company. It was far easier to buy a hollow board than to get your hands on a plank of solid redwood and try to shape your own. And for those who couldn't buy one, Blake was publishing do-it-yourself articles in places like Popular Mechanics. And again, here note I think the similarity between the Vega wing and the hollow board construction. Popular Mechanics, also Popular Science, and Modern Mechanics. The availability and ease of use of Blake's boards enticed a slew of Southern Californians into surfing in the 1930s. One final example. This is down around San Onofre. One thing just to point out very quickly, we'll come back to this, but look at the design of this. First of all, the square tail, but also the flat rail, which is basically just perpendicular to the nose, not a lot of curve to it, but then especially the curve on the bottom of the board, which does indeed, I think, not only resemble an aircraft wing, but then will be relevant to our next episode in the history of surfing. So this is the Blake hollow surfboard. Among the people who built the Blake board and took up surfing in the 1930s, among the many people who did, was a young man named Robert Simmons, who would lead the next generation of surfers to yet another aviation technology. And this is our second example, especially World War II. Military aviation demanded materials that combined high strength with light weight, and chemists at Dow and Owens Corning had developed polyurethane and polystyrene foams, fiberglass, and polyester resins. Foams and fiberglass, for example, provided lightweight insulation, and polyurethane coatings provided high gloss and corrosion-resistant airplane finishes. Although some materials, such as polyurethane and fiberglass, predated the war really drove mass production of these materials for use on industrial scales. And these same qualities, strength and lightweight, that attracted the aviation industry also interested surfers. And with many Southern Californians working in aircraft plants, military innovation soon found their way into surfing. And a central figure in this transfer was Bob Simmons. Here's a photo of Simmons explaining some of the finer points of aerodynamics to a young nephew of his. Simmons grew up in LA and Pasadena and took up surfing. Again, he built his first board from one of these Tom Blake hollow kits. Meanwhile, Simmons went to Caltech to study mechanical engineering. He dropped out in 1946, only a few units away from his degree, but basically completed all the requirements. He actually just dropped out a few weeks shy of graduation in 46. He went off and on over the course of the war. Now, as a mechanical engineering major, Simmons had 2 years of advanced math, also 2 years of physics, and took a survey of hydraulics, which included both theory and lab work on hydrodynamics. Now, as a student, Simmons was already working for Douglas Aircraft. At some point during the war, he ran across these new aviation materials, either through his work at Douglas or through his older brother, Dewey, who was working on aircraft radar at Caltech. Dewey Simmons was the inventor of the strain gauge, later engaged in, or involved in extensive litigation with Caltech over the patent rights to that. I don't know if anybody here has ever been to one of the colloquia at Caltech, but Dewey Simmons, anybody have? Dewey Simmons was famous for walking in and he wore kind of medieval costumes. A very interesting fellow, asked very interesting questions at the Caltech History of Science colloquium. Anyway, if you've seen him, you know him. He passed away several years ago. Anyway, Dewey Simmons was Bob Simmons' brother. So Bob Simmons ran across these materials during the war, either at Douglas or at Caltech or through his brother, who was working on aircraft radar at Caltech during the war. And Bob Simmons was soon making boards with a core of styrofoam, polystyrene foam, balsa rails for strength, and a plywood veneer on the surface sealed with fiberglass and polyester resin. We know that he was getting his chemicals from Dow. Here are some receipts for styrofoam orders. His contribution, however, is not only in these new materials, which he got from the aircraft industry. He also revolutionized board design. And here, too, wartime research played a part. Simmons' hydraulics professor was a professor named Robert Knapp, who was helping turn Caltech into a center for hydrodynamics. Knapp founded the Caltech Pump Lab in the basement of the Mechanical Engineering Building, originally to study how to bring Colorado River water to Los Angeles. But during the war, Knapp and his colleagues turned to research on cavitation of high-speed submarine propellers, and then to an even larger project on torpedo design under the OSRD, especially cavitation of submarine torpedoes, but also, as we'll see, the hydrodynamics of aerially dropped torpedoes. This support helped Knapp transform the pump lab into a full-fledged hydrodynamics lab. Its eventual formal title, the Hydrodynamics Lab at Caltech. This included a fully instrumented high-speed water tunnel, which is this tunnel you see in the photo here. The torpedo research in particular involved theoretical calculation of streamlined bodies moving through fluids, including drag and lift coefficients and boundary layer effects, and an extensive experimental program using this water tunnel, also 10-foot and 25-foot test tanks on campus, and an elaborate facility at nearby Morris Dam for full-scale testing of airdrop torpedoes. Basically, this project, what was happening was torpedo bombers in the Pacific were being decimated by anti-aircraft fire because they had to come in too low in order to get their torpedoes to enter the water at the right angle. If pilots could drop from higher up, they could avoid the anti-aircraft fire and live, but the problem was if you dropped them from higher up, the torpedoes would hit the water at the wrong angle and go off course. So this was basically, you can get a sense of the scale of this facility up at Morris Dam, which is just in the foothills of the San Gabriels. And basically this is just a ramp that would shoot the torpedo down, and you could obviously adjust the angle of entry to the water of these torpedoes. And then they had a fully instrumented test run stretching out across the lake here. But a very extensive program, not very well known, but a major effort at Caltech during World War II, involving a number of faculty and a lot of graduate students. We're still trying to find out if Simmons, it would be hard to believe that Simmons was not somehow involved in this, since his professor was one of the main people working on it. But so far, none of the project reports include graduate students. Graduate students get no credit back then, or maybe now. Anyway, it would have been hard for him to avoid this. We do know that he knew about the torpedo test tanks because he later used them to work out new surfboard design concepts. He was developing these new surfboard designs, then bringing them to the Caltech campus and testing them in these tanks with instruments. And again, Simmons's hydraulics class used the pump lab or the hydrodynamics lab, and his brother Dewey also worked in the pump lab during the war. And he also may have intersected this work through his employer, Douglas Aircraft, because Douglas was the main builder of American torpedo bombers at this point in the war. And Douglas got copies of all the project reports coming out of this torpedo research project. Okay, at some point in all this, Simmons ran across a Navy study on the hydrodynamics of planing holes for PT boats. PT boats, very high-speed watercraft. How do they achieve that high speed? Because being able to get up out of the water and plane. And this work similarly involved detailed hydrodynamics theory and experiments using various surfaces towed at high speed behind boats. And the results of this were published by a naval architect named Lindsay Lord, Naval Architecture of Planing Holes. And these surfaces look a lot, to me at least, and we know they did to Simmons, like surfboards. That is, flat, thin wooden shapes aimed at minimizing drag and maximizing lift and planing. And we know that Simmons had a copy of this book. He studied it diligently and marked it up, and soon applied this research to surfboards. Here's a few other photos from Lindsay Lord's book. And Simmons, again, started testing these new designs in the Caltech tanks, and the results departed dramatically from the existing boxy surfboards that we saw in that photo of Tom Blake, the surfer with the dog. Here's what became known as the famous Simmons board. Again, instead of this very curved, exaggerated, what they call rocker on the bottom of a board, it's actually more of a flat bottom. It's actually got a concave running down the middle. It's got twin fins, but also instead of these boxy flat rails, it's got downturned rails and first of all, a rounded nose, but also what he called a scarfed nose, where the concave starts. Simmons thereafter insisted that his designs were not surfboards, but he called them hydrodynamic planing holes. And these boards soon proliferated through surf lineups from San Diego to Ventura. A couple of quotes to suggest the impact of Simmons's boards on the surf community. Bev Morgan, one of the most prominent surfers at the time. Simmons was the one, a quantum leap. And Peter Cole is another legendary surfer from that period. Flatly declares that Simmons has done more for modern surfing than any other surfer. Simmons's boards affected performance styles. They encouraged a new hot dogging style, what was called hot dogging, as surfers began arcing across the wave face. Instead of just riding a wave straight in, with the Simmons boards, you could begin turning, doing bottom turns like this surfer is doing here at Malibu, cutbacks, a vast repertoire of soul arches, head dips, and hang tens. This new style heightened surfing's appeal as a medium of individual expression and hence as an antidote to 1950s conformity. The new lightweight boards also encouraged women to take up the sport. Joe Quigg, who had worked for Simmons, introduced what he called a 60-pound girl board, capital G, capital B, and subsequent models in the 1950s cut that weight in half again. Here's a slide of Simmons and Joe Quigg at Malibu in 1950, riding the new boards. By 1956, using one of these girl boards, so-called girl boards, a 5-foot-tall, 95-pound girl could handle one of these new boards. 5 feet tall, 95 pounds, that happened to be the size of Kathy Koner, whose stature earned a nickname from the Malibu crew, a mixture or combination of girl and midget. Yes, Gidget. And Gidget's story, translated to Hollywood, would also greatly expand surfing's appeal. So that board that Kathy Koner is holding in this photo probably weighs about 30 pounds. So we've gone from something on the order of 150 pounds with the redwood planks that Duke surfed to 70 or 80 pounds, 90 pounds, probably closer to 70 or 80 pounds with the Tom Blake hollow board, down to something on the order of 30 pounds, thanks to these new aerospace materials, foam, fiberglass, and resin. 6 years after Simmons, despite recent talk of green or organic surfboard materials, well over 90% of surfboards are still made with the products of World War II. As one shaper put it, well, here you can read the quote, you really have to get the proper inflection for the last part, though. When you pick the 10-pound thing up, it's like, whoa, and not in a good way. Fletcher Chenard, the son of Yvonne Chenard, shapes for Patagonia, he really nicely evokes, I think, the source of the prevailing paradigm, that is the United States military. You need the military or someone with really deep pockets to develop something that really works. Okay, our final example, briefly, considers a new tool for wave riding that opened up surfing to thousands and eventually millions of converts. This is a gentleman named Tom Moray. Tom Moray grew up riding waves in Southern California, earned a degree in math from USC in 1957. He then went to work as an engineer for, yes, Douglas Aircraft, helping to develop the process chemistry for new composite materials. This included a new honeycomb material, which Moray soon incorporated into surfboards. After a couple of years, he moved from Douglas to Avco, which was working on ablative materials for rocket nozzles, materials that would basically burn away from the heat of the rocket exhaust. This is the rocket, the Nike Zeus rocket for missile defense, which needed to be especially fast, hence burned especially hot. So they were looking at ablative materials for the rocket nozzles, looking at particular materials, especially fiberglass. Fiberglass was one of the main ablative materials used both in re-entry vehicle nose cones and also things like these rocket nozzles. So they were using special fiberglass weaves, also special crystalline fiberglass that interacts with the resin in particular ways to allow it to ablate more. This experience led Moray to experiment with different materials in surfboards, including some of these special fiberglass weaves that he borrowed from Aerospace. In general, encouraged an experimental mindset, introducing him to aerospace materials that were off the radar of most surfboard builders. After several years, Moray left Aerospace to start a surfboard business. In 1971, he began thinking about how to get more people surfing and buying his surfboards. At the time, many drugstores sold these plain styrofoam boards that were basically like beer cooler material that were molded into the shape of a surfboard. I don't know how many of you remember these things. You could go into any, five and dime or a sporting goods shop and walk out one of these basically beer cooler boards under your arm, and you happily plunge in the waves with the styrofoam board, and within minutes you are walking out of the waves because you've got several chunks of shattered styrofoam in your hands. In addition to breaking at the first opportunity, these styrofoam boards basically you can do almost nothing on them except just ride a wave straight in. So Moray is looking for a way to combine, first of all, durability with performance and also low price. And the result was the boogie board. Moray is thinking about this. He gets a slab of polyethylene foam from Dow Chemical. He takes a small electric carving knife to it and carves out a small template, body boring template, and then adds a paper mache style skin to it to seal the exterior. The result was a board that was soft enough not to hurt if it hit you, but rigid enough to plane on water at speed and to hold its edge in a turn. And the skin provided a slick surface and, again, provided a waterproof coating. And in short, the boards were fast and fun and safe and not too hard to make. This is it's now been, he's got it wrapped in some kind of film for protection, but that's the first boogie board. In 1973, Moray trademarked the boogie board name and made the boards available first as a kit through mail order. For $25, you got a shaped core, 2 skins, a razor blade, sandpaper, and a Xeroxed copy of Moray's handwritten instruction manual. But however downscale the production values, boogie boards began sprouting in California lineups. By 1977, Moray was producing 80,000 boogie boards a year. Since then, cheap, mass-produced boogie boards have introduced millions to the sport of surfing. Anyone can do it. You just lay down on top, catch a wave, and away you go. How many of you have tried boogie boarding? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right. I have to confess that yours truly here, I got my start on a boogie board in 1978. That was my introduction to surfing, and now, gratuitous family shot. My 8-year-old son is now riding one. In short, the boogie board fulfilled Moray's goal. It democratized surfing. And here is a horde of boogie boarders at the birthplace of surfing, Waikiki Beach in Honolulu. Okay, these 3 examples help answer the basic question, why did Southern California become the center of global surf culture? The answer lies in what else was happening in Southern California, namely aerospace. Southern California surfers capitalized on this proximity to acquire a series of new technologies, Blake's hollow board, foam and fiberglass materials, and Moray's boogie board. Aerospace technologies made surfing more accessible and created legions of new surfers who went out and defined Southern California culture. And access to aerospace technologies made Southern California the center of the surf industry, a global market with over $15 billion in sales each year as of today. Now, this should not imply technological determinism. It just pushes the question back a step so that we must ask why Southern California was such an aerospace hotbed. And we've already considered some of the answers to that question. And aerospace influence was, of course, not just technological. The industry supported Southern California's proliferating middle class, and hence the leisure and youth cultures underpinning the surf community, especially after World War II. We might also turn the question around and ask about surfing's influence on aerospace. Now here the connections are a bit hazier, although those Mars rover airbags do look suspiciously like beach balls bouncing across the sand. But surf culture reached the heart of the military-industrial complex in ways aside from technologies, and here we might consider revising the popular image of the surfer. From Cliff Robertson's Kahuna and Gidget to Sean Penn's Spicoli in Fast Times at Ridgemont High, the surfer has been a subversive rebel, a social dropout. But while surfers were indeed giving Organization Man Society the finger, figuratively and often literally, they were capitalizing on technologies from the military-industrial complex, and often, like Volte, Simmons, and Morey, working within it. Surfing, in short, is perhaps not as countercultural as surfers portray it. And neither was post-war aerospace industry a conservative monolith of men in gray flannel suits, or perhaps men in white shirts with pocket protectors. California's counterculture, including surfing, may have leavened aerospace culture. Consider Daniel Ellsberg, a longtime RAND strategist who returned from a tour in Vietnam a pronounced critic of the war. The late 1960s found Ellsberg living in a Malibu beach house, smoking dope, and body surfing every day. He himself said of surfing, and I quote, "There was nothing in the world I liked better." Now, surfing may not have turned Ellsberg against the war, but after staying up all night photocopying the Pentagon Papers, what was the first thing Ellsberg did? He drove to Malibu to catch some waves.